All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this NOCTI Spotlight webinar. My name is Ashley. I'm the Outreach Coordinator here at NOCTI, and I'll be your facilitator for today's session, where we'll be discussing how to determine the quality of your credentials that you're using. I'd like to introduce our presenter for the session, Dr. John Foster, the President and CEO of NOCTI. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Everyone, please welcome John.
Hey, thanks very much, Ashley. It's a pleasure to be in front of this group. We kind of had some conversations with Greg McAtee of NCATC, the National Coalition for Advanced Technology Centers, back at his last meeting, and we've been a founding partner of the organization for a while, and we talked about the possibility of doing a couple of little spotlight sessions and whether or not he thought his audience would be of interest, and of course he said he would. So we have set up, I think, 3 or 4 of them coming up in the next probably 5 or 6 months. Some of them bleed over into next fall, but this is the first, and we kind of intended these to be about a half an hour or so, maybe a little bit less, and just kind of give folks an overview of some of the things that we have a little bit of background in. So without further ado, I'm going to just jump right into the slides. So what we're going to talk about today is basically a little bit about understanding the new definitions of what a credential is, take a look at some factors beneath the surface, of course, and explore a little bit of the data that is available through the credentialing process. A lot of this is, being spurred on by the, the revision of Perkins 4, now Perkins 5, and the CLNA, the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment that has to be done to utilize federal Perkins dollars. So some of this presentation is somewhat tied to that. But before I get ahead of myself, when we talk in our organization about credentialing, what we typically think of are the terminology that's been used by the Credential Engine folks. We have another presentation later on Credential Engine for those of you who may not be familiar with the Credential Engine, but just to give you a snapshot, the Credential Engine is a philanthropically funded group. I believe there's Gates money in it, Lumina money, JP Morgan, Walmart monies. There's quite a bit of philanthropic funding behind it, but the idea is to make credentials transparent. And what they've done, one of the first parts of their work is to define what it is when we say, credential. A credential encompasses all the categories you see on the screen. So we're actually using the Credential Engine's terminology to define what a credential is and essentially what a certificate is. So they typically use the terminology that you see on the screen, which includes degrees and diplomas, as well as some of the other things that we think about when we think of the word certification or credentials. So the big question is, what do all these things mean to everybody who's talking about them? Well, when we talk to employers, we know that employers really want to make sure that they're putting the best folks, in their employment. And of course, in order to do that, they need some mechanism of validating the skills of those people that they're hiring. So, certifications and credentials have sort of become a shorthand for, common competencies and credentials and skills, both, knowledge and skills. And so employers have come to recognize these certifications as shorthand, so to speak, for the skills that a potential employee represents. And of course, teachers, whether you're at the secondary or the post-secondary level, credentials matter to you because, in these days of Perkins 5 and even in the days of Perkins 4, the decisions that we make in education are really data-driven. And with this every 2-year needs assessment that has been mandated, there's going to be a lot of focus on using data derived from technical skill assessments and certifications to do a lot of things. One, to provide professional development, another to provide individualized instruction. So if you use a pre-test and a post-test, with your credentialing pieces, that sort of thing matters. And another is just, longitudinally, when you look at a particular program, a particular technical program, year in and year out, what common patterns do you see, and how can you use that to improve the instruction? So that's the reason they kind of matter to, employers and, of course, to teachers of all ilks. But the big question is, were credentials really all created equally? And what I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time digging into, the other side of credentials. So we're going to use an analogy with glaciers and icebergs, because, when you see something floating on the surface, you really never know how deep that surface object goes. And, there are a lot of things that lie beneath it that you may or may not know about. So that's the analogy we're going to use. So we're going to move forward and talk just a minute about credential providers. When you think about credential providers, you're talking about organizations that could be industry associations, they could be testing organizations, they could be all sorts of groups that deliver these credentials. So when you think about the kind of the technical aspects of a particular credential, there's a couple of questions that you can ask. The first bullet there on this particular slide is the provider accredited? Those who deliver credentials of almost any ilk should be accredited by an organization, a personnel accrediting organization. And the ISO standard that governs personnel accrediting bodies is ISO 17024. That's the organization that governs us, just like organizations that govern the courses and skill sets that both secondary and community college delivers. There's also an accrediting body for organizations that deliver industry credentials. So you might think about that as a technical qualification when you start to look at what credentials are available to your particular student body. The second bullet there talks about who uses the assessments and how frequently those credentialing assessments are utilized by who. And of course, the third bullet is, who actually values those credentials. If you're talking about an organization like the American Culinary Federation, well, then obviously you're dealing with a national body, and the folks involved in that particular occupational area would value a national credential by a national association. Let's look a little bit deeper at the assessments themselves. We talked about a certification or a credential being a shorthand for a set of skills. Well, those sets of skills are measured through some sort of an assessment. So by default, an assessment becomes part of a credential, and that assessment of that particular piece of content, is really assessed by an assessment. That could be a cognitive assessment, it could be a psychomotor assessment, but it is assessed. So we can look at the technical nature of how the assessment was developed. What was that assessment based on? Was it based on some small group of people, or was it based on a national sampling of people? Was it based on the standards of a national association, or was it based on a private business's product, like a Microsoft product or something like that? What processes were followed? One of the things the ISO 17024 does establish is it establishes a process that guarantees that the assessments that the credentials are based on are valid and reliable. So that's a reason that having a body that's accredited by 17024 or using those standards is important. Who is involved in the development? How were those subject matter experts selected? Did someone actually vet the credentials of those subject matter experts? Are they available online in a technical manual? Do you have to request them? And does the assessment have a national focus? These are all questions to ask when you're trying to select a certification or a credential when you look at the technical aspects of how it was developed. Let's look at its impact on the classroom. Let's look for a second at the results and, what they look like. If you're an instructor in a classroom or a teacher in a classroom, again, regardless of whether what environment that's in, you're looking for data that is, pretty descriptive of the population that you've a third-party assessment for a credential. So you're looking for something more than just pass-fail. If you're getting just whether the student passed or failed year in and year out, that really doesn't provide you much information about how to improve your pass rate on a longitudinal basis. If you got 40 students in a particular group that take this particular credentialing exam and 20 get through one year, the next year 30 get through, next year it drops back to 25, all you know is the number who got through. You don't really know why they got through. You just know that they got through. So when you think about data that results from credentialing assessments, you want to make sure that there's comparative data provided by whoever your vendor happens to be. It would be nice, it would be advantageous to you if that data was broken out by, in our terminology, standards. If you're looking at a construction assessment and subsequent credential, the standards might be something like blueprint reading and hand tool use and power tool use and floor framing and wall framing and interior trim and those kinds of things. And within each of those standards, there are competencies. For example, in the area of wall framing, there might be layout of framing members. There might be detail of openings in a particular wall, doors, windows, those kinds of things. Those are competencies within a particular standard. So when you look at the data that you get from a credentialing assessment, it would be good to know that if you have scores that are available per student or per class by standard or by competency. In that way, you can see if there are patterns. In other words, you could see if there were patterns that students over the years scored poorly in blueprint reading, for example. Well, then we need to look at the instructional capabilities that your program delivers in terms of blueprint reading. Doesn't necessarily mean the instructor, him or herself, are doing an inappropriate job. What it means might be that your media that you're using is incorrect, that you're not giving students enough time to practice. There's all sorts of reasons, but unless you have the data, you really don't know. Another bullet there is how timely are the results? When do those results appear? If you don't get the results for a year after, then that's not very useful to you for planning purposes. And what level of detail is provided. I kind of alluded to that when I talked about standards and competencies. So that's kind of some general things to think about when you look at the technical aspects of certifications and licenses and all those sorts of things, certificates. In our organization, just looking at us for just a second, we are an accredited body. 17024 standards. We follow industry standards on assessment development, and we provide our test holders with a wealth of information that's available. We also happen to have college credit available through the National College Credit Recommendation Service and 1,500 colleges and universities nationwide. We provide digital badges and also something called a workforce competency credential, which is based on industry-specific scores on each of the credentialing assessments that we provide. So let's dig into the data just a little bit, because as I mentioned up front, data seems to be, more and more an important criteria, an important component when we're talking about education, particularly career and technical education, and how it relates specifically with Perkins 5. So, everybody kind of understands that data is important, but there's a little bit of uncertainty as we talk to audiences about the type of data, how to understand it, and how to use it. when you look at an educational decision-making cycle of sorts, and you look at data in terms of data that's used with a technical credential, you can see that there's a part where you take a look at you do the teaching, you assess whether or not the teaching was able to attain a credential through a credentialing assessment. You gather the data that the credentialing assessment provides, you analyze the data, and then you create an action plan to improve instruction the next time around. Then you teach again, you assess again, you capture data, etc. The idea is that you're using a process of thoughtful decision making. And when you think about that process as it relates to the comprehensive local needs assessment, they are kind of aligned. You have a planning team, you have data sources, you have disaggregated data, you have identification of areas of growth and strength, identification of areas of opportunity, then a prioritization of the opportunities. My focus in this particular little presentation was mostly about credentials and the data that they provide, whereas the Perkins process is a little bit broader. They're drawing data from not just technical assessments, but other resources as well. Nonetheless, the parallel exists between this process, the Perkins process, and just an instructional improvement cycle. So let's just take a look at the local needs assessment and how NOCTI may be able to help. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but on the left-hand side, the columns specifically talk about some items that are addressed in the new Perkins 5 legislation. I'll spend a little bit of time on the third bullet, for example, or the third block, for example, recruitment, retention, and training of faculty and staff. Using data that we provide through technical skill assessment, we can identify areas where there might be a need for professional development for a particular teacher. We can also provide assessments so that the hiring party knows that the individual being hired has all aspects of the industry covered. So those are just two little quick examples of how we may help with the the Perkins process. If you haven't taken a look at Perkins 5 and the language that's in it, here's again just a couple of quick snippets of why data is important. Disaggregated data by each core indicated by a program or career cluster, by subpopulations. I already mentioned the professional development and the fact that it should be data driven. And the idea with the needs assessment is that you're identifying disparities or gaps so that when you do the state plan the next time, it appears that you've addressed those disparities or gaps. Maybe a quick example of some actual data would help here. On the screen right now, we have a carpentry class. I know probably most of you on the presentation today aren't as familiar with our process or our reports, but what you're looking at right now is a typical class report that an instructor would get, and this one happens to be related to carpentry. This first column is a single participant in the carpentry class, and we're not going to dwell on that information right now. This next column is a group of data, so it could be a class. This next column is the school itself or the college itself, and it's a listing of the number of, in this case, carpentry programs in that particular site. This next column, of course, is the average of the programs in the state, and this next column is the average of the programs across the nation. So what you're looking at here is the major standards within the carpentry credential. There's safety, there's tools and accessories, there's blueprints and reading, foundation forms, et cetera, et cetera. And what you're looking at is a group score here and a site score, a state score, a national score. Again, let's forget about the participant score for the time being. So having access to that data, you can quickly identify the areas that this particular class is doing well in. If you look at blueprints, reading, and estimation, this particular class, the average was a 95%. That is higher than the overall school average. It's higher than the state average. It's higher than the national average. See if we can pull up another example of something that's pretty good. Sure, safety. This particular class had an 86. The school on average had a 79. The nation had a 72, and the nation had a 75, and the state had a 72. So what we found is a couple areas instructionally that seem to be doing pretty well. Just in this little simple example, we can also find areas that aren't doing well in this particular class. Here's a 56.3 on the standard department-related math, and that's lower than the other norms in this particular case. Here's another one, interior systems installation. Again, you see that the average for this particular class is lower than the other three. So something's going on here, and unless you have data like this that's representative of standards in this case within an occupational area, you really don't have a means for improvement. Think about this just being pass-fail information. Well, that really doesn't provide you an area of focus. So the data that you get from a credentialing exam or a certificate or a certification is critically important for lots of reasons. This is just one. Here's one of a big system. Let me see if I can show you another example. This is from a particular state. This happens to be a secondary program, but it's a program that a state uses, one of our particular clients. And what you're looking at in this case are the competencies for culinary. Now, this isn't all of them. I think there are 70 or so competencies, but these are the first few. And what you're looking at in these columns are schools in this particular state. So school 1, school 2, school 3, school 4, etc. The colors signify ranges of percentages. So in the case of the red, I apologize, there's not a legend here, but in the case of the red, those are areas where 50% or less of the students at that particular school didn't do well on a particular competency. The yellow is a range of 50 to 80%. So students in that case, in the yellow cases, are scoring between 50 and 80% in, for example, utilizing large and small equipment. The green is 80% and above. So as a state administrator, what you could do with this kind of data, or if you have a school with a number of branches that you have similar programs in, think about what you could do with this kind of data. Well, take a look down here at the red one, preparing cold soups, appetizers, entrees, and desserts. It appears that in this state example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 schools out of, from this graph, 12 aren't doing so well. They're doing less than 50%. So obviously, this is an area, if we're looking at some sort of technical professional development, we need to, take a look at it a little bit deeper. Here's one that's all green. Almost every school in this particular assessment was 80% or above in terms of maintaining all kitchen equipment. Well, that's an area you're doing well with. Here's another one. Exhibit an understanding of prevention, causes, and response to workplace injuries. Doing well with that one too, and you're doing well with garnishing and plating menu items. Again, look at the detail of this kind of data from a national credentialing kind of an assessment or certification process. If you're not getting data that you can do this kind of analysis with, you might need to ask some further questions about your certification provider. Because really, the bottom line is that without data, you're just another person with an opinion.
Hey, John, we have a question back on the previous slide. If a row turns out to be mostly red, could it be possible that the assessment questions for that standard or that competency area need to be reviewed?
Sure would. Yeah, that's a great point. And since this is a state example, yeah, we would want to look at all the schools in the state. We didn't, with this particular slide, I didn't have room to put all the schools in the state on this particular one, but one of the things we would do as an organization is go back and look at the national data and see if that was reflected in the national data as well. And if it was, then yeah, obviously there may be a question difficulty there too. And again, as I mentioned, this isn't meant to be any sort of a gotcha. It's just meant to be something to look into further. You know, if you see all reds in that area, it doesn't mean that the teacher of that program isn't doing their job. It just means that there's an issue that needs to be addressed. Like I said, it could be maybe the problem was the facility. Maybe there wasn't ample space for all students to practice enough to get that competency right. Maybe it was an equipment issue. Maybe there wasn't enough equipment in order for the students to do that. You know, there's all sorts of reasons. And the other issue too that you can address is, in addition to just looking at that particular year's data, you could look at that data longitudinally. At NOCTI, we typically revise our assessments every 3 to 4 years, but you could look at other assessments in other years that haven't been you know, changed, that weren't adapted, and you could see if the same kind of conditions apply. So yeah, that's a great question. So thank you. So we're pretty close to the end of this little presentation. Like I said, I wanted to try to keep it to pretty much a half an hour, which we've gotten pretty close to. I just want to put in a little quick plug. One of our partners, of course, is ACTE. That's the Association of Career and Technical Education, and we do have a book that we put out. This book utilizes the data from the National Research Center in Career and Technical Education from the last Perkins authorization. We've just revised it. It includes a couple new case studies, and it changes, you know, has a little bit of a different national perspective. So that book is available on ACT's website if you wanted to go to their bookstore and look at it. The difference about this particular book is that what it does is it starts with technical data first, and then it infuses other sorts of data next. In fact, actually, tomorrow and Friday, I'll be doing a professional development workshop in another state with a small group of folks who want to utilize this book to do a data analysis. And some of the sample information that they gave us was attendance and discipline data. And when you look at things like attendance and discipline data, they're indicators of motivation of students within any particular classroom environment. So if you're seeing low scores, like the gentleman mentioned, with the you know, with the red bar, you know, maybe that particular time when that information was presented, a lot of students decided that they didn't like that content, and they decided not to be in attendance that day. You know, so there's all kinds of factors that you want to look at when you start to analyze data, and this particular book talks about triangulating that data. So starting with technical data, infusing other data that might be available, and coming up with a bona fide action plan.
If you walk away from today's presentation and you think, oh, here, now I have a question, feel free to email us. Our email address is nocti@nocti.org, and we can answer any questions that you have. You can also give us a call, and then John's email is on the screen for you as well if you'd like to contact him directly.
Yeah, thanks very much for attending today. I hope we've been able to give you a little bit of information that's going to help in your particular jobs. We all believe in the benefits and the merit of career and technical education here at NOCTI, and anything we can do to help, we certainly want to do that. So thank you for your time this afternoon, and I'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.